She had no family, no money, and nowhere to run, until the silent cowboy took her hand without saying a word. The train hissed into the Silver Bluff station like a wounded animal, its wheels grinding against the old tracks with a final groan. Passengers disembarked in twos and threes, clutching luggage, calling for cabs, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Among them stood one woman alone. She wore a faded shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and boots too large for her feet. The hem of her dress was frayed, stained with soot and dirt. Her cheeks were streaked with dust, and strands of chestnut hair clung to the dampness of her skin. A deep purple bruise bloomed along her jaw, half hidden beneath the edge of her scarf. The station master leaned out of his booth, holding a clipboard and a pencil dulled from routine. "Name?" he asked, not unkindly, just following protocol. She looked up slowly. Her voice was cracked, as if it had not been used in days. "I don't have one," she said. The man frowned. "Everyone's got a name, miss." "Not anymore." He opened his mouth to press her, but something in her eyes made him stop. It was not fear or pride, it was emptiness. He handed her a slip of paper with a half-hearted shrug and turned to the next passenger in line. She wandered through the square, clutching her small cloth bag to her chest like it held her last breath. Children stared. A merchant muttered something under his breath as she passed, something about women who travel alone. At the boarding house she knocked once, and the door was slammed in her face before she could speak. By sunset, she had found a dry patch of ground behind the general store. The walls blocked the worst of the wind. She curled on her side, using the bag as a pillow, her fingers clenched tightly around the strap. The stars blinked to life above her like cold, distant eyes. She did not sleep, not really. The cold bit at her bones, and the sounds from the alley kept her on edge. Voices echoed nearby, drunken men stumbling out from the saloon. One voice laughed. "Pretty one, that," he slurred. "Bet she'd be grateful for company." Another chuckled. "Reckon she'd trade anything for a warm bed tonight." Footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate. She reached down into her boot, where a shard of broken glass had been tucked for days. Her fingers curled around it. She did not breathe. Then, silence. The men stopped. One of them muttered something too low to hear. Then the other hissed, "Grady!" She peeked through the cracks between the stacked crates. A man stood at the end of the alley, shadowed and still. His coat brushed the ground. His shoulders were broad and unmoving. He said nothing, made no threat. He did not have to. The two drunks retreated as if chased by something much colder than night. Their boots scraped the alley stones, retreating faster than they had approached. The woman did not move. The man, Grady, stood there in silence, not coming closer. But even in the dark, she could feel the weight of his gaze. He stood as if he were waiting for something, as if he knew she needed to see him, to know someone had seen her. But he never spoke, never stepped forward. After a long moment, he turned and walked away. She stayed awake until dawn, eyes open, fingers still gripping the shard of glass. When the sun finally lifted itself above the hills, the town began to stir. Wagons creaked past. Shopkeepers unbolted their doors. She sat up slowly, her bones stiff and her head heavy. That morning, the whispers began. "She came in last night. No luggage, no ring. Heard she was from the east, you know, where that fire was." Weston Grady looked at her. No one's seen him look at anyone in years. "She's trouble, you watch." But she did not hear them, or if she did, she gave no sign. She walked through the town again, knocking on back doors, asking for work. The bakery sent her away. The tailor laughed in her face. No name, no references, no chance. By dusk, she returned to the alley, too tired to cry, too hungry to stand. She leaned her head against the wall and let the tears fall, silent, slow, angry at themselves for still being possible. Then the shadow returned. She looked up, and there he was again, the man from the night before. Weston Grady. He did not speak. His face was carved from silence and smoke, lined with old scars. His eyes were gray, unreadable, like storm clouds that refused to break. He simply reached out his hand. She stared at it for a long time, and then, because she had no name, no husband, and no place left to run, she took it. The next morning the town was already waking when she stepped back into its streets. She tried again. Quiet knocks on kitchen doors, polite questions behind butcher counters. Each response was a variation of the same answer. No, no, and absolutely not. Some looked away, others scoffed. One woman handed her a crust of bread, only to snatch it back when she learned the girl had no last name to offer. By mid-afternoon, her legs trembled. Her lips were dry, her stomach hollow. She made her way back to the same corner behind the general store, the only place in Silver Bluff that had not pushed her away with words. She slid down the wall, hugging her knees to her chest, and rested her head against the splintered wood. She did not hear him approach. When she opened her eyes, he was already there, Weston Grady. Same long coat, same storm gray eyes, same silence. He did not speak, did not ask. He simply stood, then offered his hand, palm open, fingers steady. She stared at it. She could have said no. She could have turned away, waited for something else, or nothing at all. But there was nothing left to wait for. And something about the way he stood there, not expectant, not even hopeful, just present, made her reach out. Her fingers touched his. Rough, warm, human, and she let him pull her to her feet. They did not take the main road out of town. He led her along a back trail behind the churchyard, through dried creek beds and narrow deer paths that twisted upward into the hills. The climb was quiet, broken only by the wind brushing tall grass and the creak of leather as his boots moved ahead of hers. He had a horse tied near the tree line. She hesitated at first, unsure whether to trust him fully, but when her legs gave out beneath her, he caught her with one arm and helped her onto the saddle. The horse moved slow and careful, as if it understood its rider was fragile. The sun was slipping behind the ridge when they reached the cabin. It looked like it had grown out of the land itself, weathered, rooted, half covered in creeping vine. Smoke curled gently from the stone chimney. No fence, no flowers, just wood, rock, and stillness. Weston dismounted and tied the reins. He opened the front door without turning to look at her. For a moment she stayed frozen in the saddle. Then quietly, she slid down and followed him inside. The warmth hit her first, not just heat, but the scent. Cedar, old tobacco, something simmering. The cabin had 2 rooms barely divided by a wooden beam. In the main room stood a small fireplace, a sturdy table, shelves lined with jars and cans. The floor creaked, but the space was clean, lived in. He gestured toward the cot by the far wall. Then, without a word, he set down a basin of clean water and a cloth. On the table, a plate of beans and bread steamed softly. She hovered near the door, uncertain. "Eat," he said finally. His voice was deep, worn with disuse. "Sleep. Go when you're strong." She looked at him. His face gave away nothing. He turned to walk toward the other room. Her voice cracked as she answered, quieter than she meant to. "I don't have anywhere else to go." He paused, just for a breath. Then he disappeared into the other room, the door clicking shut behind him. She stood alone in the quiet for a long time. Then she sat at the table. The bread was rough, but warm. The beans were plain, but real. She ate slowly, the taste overwhelming her more than she expected. When she had finished, she washed her hands in the basin, peeled off the scarf that had clung to her face for days, and sat on the edge of the cot. A blanket rested at the foot, folded neatly. She did not cry. Not yet. Instead, she lay down and closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe she might survive the night. And somewhere in the quiet, outside the coyotes, far off in the distance, but inside, there was only stillness and warmth. She woke before the sun most mornings, her body still on edge from months of running, and nights spent half sleeping with one eye open. At first, she moved around the cabin carefully, unsure of the boundaries, unsure what she was allowed to touch. But Weston never stopped her, never told her to sit down, never said no. So she swept the floor, scrubbed the stove, repaired the tear in a curtain with thread she found tucked in a jar. She never spoke unless he did first, and he rarely did. His movements were precise, habitual. At dawn, he'd saddle his horse and disappear up the ridge with a satchel over his shoulder, returning only after dusk with supplies, wood, sacks of potatoes, sometimes nothing at all. Days passed like this. Silence filled the cabin, but it was not empty silence. It was a silence of coexistence, of mutual retreat. He gave her space. She gave him solitude. That was the unspoken agreement. But questions bloomed in her chest. Ones she buried under chores. Why did he live up here alone? Why no visitors? Why no photos hung on the walls? It was on the 7th morning that curiosity overcame her caution. She waited until he left, then followed the trail he took, staying far enough behind that he wouldn't hear her steps. The path wound through the pines and opened into a small clearing overlooking the valley. And there she saw him. He knelt beside 2 wooden crosses, one tall, one barely the height of his knee. He wasn't praying, wasn't speaking, just sat with his head bowed, fingers resting on the edge of the earth, like he could still feel the warmth of the bodies buried beneath it. She froze. Something in the set of his shoulders made her throat tighten. She took one step back, and her foot cracked a twig. He turned sharply, their eyes locked. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He stood slowly, his face unreadable. "Don't follow me," he said. His voice was rougher than before. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but nothing came. He turned and walked away, disappearing behind the trees without another word. Back at the cabin, the silence felt different. Not neutral, not shared. She packed quietly that night. There was nothing much to take, just the loaf of bread left from the night before, the small bar of soap, the scarf she had worn when she arrived. She folded everything into the cloth bag and slung it over her shoulder. She left a small note scratched into the corner of a page torn from an old book, just 3 words. "Thank you. Sorry." She didn't know what direction she was heading, only that she had crossed a line, and that the guilt of it weighed heavier than any fear she'd known. The air was colder than she remembered, the mountain path steeper. Her boots rubbed blisters into her heels within an hour. By midday, her legs shook with every step, and the sun burned through the last of her strength. She stumbled near a dry riverbed and collapsed on a patch of rock, too exhausted to cry, too dizzy to call for help. The last thing she saw was the sky, wide and pale above the bare trees. Then nothing. When her eyes fluttered open, night was falling fast. The sky had turned from steel to ink. She couldn't move her arms, could barely lift her head, but she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate. A shape blocked out the stars. Weston. He didn't speak. He crouched beside her, slid his arms beneath her knees and shoulders and lifted her like she weighed nothing. Her head lolled against his chest. His coat smelled like smoke and pine sap. She didn't resist. She didn't have the strength to fight him, and, for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't want to. They didn't speak on the way back. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the rhythm of his steps lulling her into darkness. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open with his boot and carried her straight to the bed, not the cot she'd been using, but the large bed in the back room. He laid her down gently, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and left. Moments later, she heard one door close softly and then another. For the first time since arriving, she was alone in his room. She turned her head into the pillow and let the tears come, not from fear, not from pain, but from something deeper, a grief she hadn't named, a kindness she hadn't earned, and she slept, deeply, dreamlessly, safe. The fever came like a thief in the night. She had been pushing herself too hard, up before dawn, hauling water from the creek, kneading bread with numb fingers. Maybe it was the cold that had seeped too deep into her bones that morning she collapsed. Maybe it was exhaustion from months of running finally catching up to her. Whatever the cause, her body gave out. Weston found her by the hearth, her skin flushed with heat, eyes glassy, breath shallow. He did not shout, did not panic. He just knelt beside her and gathered her into his arms. He placed her back into the larger bed, the one he had given her once before, and began the quiet work of nursing someone he barely knew. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Through the haze, she felt cool cloths pressed to her forehead, the sting of bitter herbs on her tongue. She caught glimpses of Weston's face, always close, always steady. He never left the cabin. She could hear the creak of the floorboards as he moved, the sound of soup simmering low, the hush of his voice murmuring something she could never quite understand. Once, she woke in the middle of the night to find him asleep in the chair by the bed, head tilted back, jaw unshaven, one hand resting near hers on the edge of the blanket. He stayed. When the fever finally broke, her body felt weak but light, like something had burned clean through her. She blinked in the soft morning light and sat up slowly. A heavier quilt covered her now, one she didn't recognize, thick, stitched with faded red and blue patches. On the nightstand beside her was a bowl of warm broth, steam still curling from the surface. She ate slowly, her hands trembling. Afterward, as she stood for the first time in days, her eyes wandered around the room. She had never really looked before. Now she did. On a narrow shelf sat a few belongings: a worn leather Bible, a silver pocket watch, frozen at 4:16, a wooden horse carved by hand with the name Lily etched on the base. A pair of small children's boots rested beside the door. Near the wardrobe hung a dress, pale blue with lace along the collar, the kind someone once wore on Sundays. Not hers, not recent, but carefully kept. That evening, she made her way back into the main room. Weston was there, stoking the fire. He looked up when he saw her, his eyes scanning her face, checking for color, clarity. He nodded once. "You're stronger," he said. She nodded back and sat across from him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, staring into the flames, she whispered, "I wasn't sick, just from the cold." Weston didn't respond, but he didn't turn away either. "My father used to say I was too wild," she continued, "too much like my mother, who he hated. When he drank, he got mean. When I turned 16, he got worse." She swallowed. "They promised me to a man, rich, older. He seemed kind until the ring was on my hand. Then it was just hands on my neck, his or my father's depending on the day." Weston's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. "I tried to leave once. They locked me in the pantry for 3 days. No water, no light. After that, I waited. Saved what I could. And then, one night, I ran." The silence between them grew heavy, but not crushing. After a moment, Weston spoke. "I was in town getting supplies when it happened," he said quietly. She looked up. "The fire," he said. "A pipe burst in the stove. Neighbors said they didn't even scream. The smoke too fast." He stared into the flames like they still lived behind his eyes. "My wife's name was June, my daughter, Lily. She was 4. Used to ride on my shoulders, pull my ears, and say I was the tallest tree in the world." His voice did not break. It didn't need to. "I buried them behind the ridge. Built the cabin again. Stayed. They sat together like that for a long time. 2 people whose pasts had been burned down, trying to warm themselves by the same fire." That night, she slept in the cot again, but something had shifted. The air in the room was less cold. The quiet no longer bit at her. The next morning, she found a small bundle left by the front door. It was a pair of boots. Soft leather, worn in just enough to be comfortable, just new enough to feel like a gift. Tucked inside was a folded slip of paper. "For the one who walks beside me." She held it in her hand for a long time, then pressed it to her chest. He did not say much. But she was beginning to understand that Weston Grady's silence was not absence, it was presence. spoken in actions, written in the language of staying. The rumors had started weeks ago, soft as dust and just as persistent. "She's still up there," they whispered in the saloon, "living with him like a wife. Grady's taken in some runaway girl, no name, no ring. She's not from around here. Bet she's the one the papers wrote about, the judge's daughter." The murmurs traveled from porch to porch, growing teeth. And then Eli Burns rode into Silver Bluff. No one had seen him in 2 years, not since the brawl where Weston Grady broke his brother's jaw and half the saloon furniture with it. But now he was back, wearing a badge again, a new star on his chest, and a telegram folded in his pocket. It came from the capital. Missing person, female, early 20s, daughter of Judge William Corwin, last seen boarding a westbound train, suspected runaway, possibly abducted. The sketch was vague but unmistakable, especially to Burns. He did not wait for backup. He mounted his horse and rode into the hills, cold wind pressing at his collar. She was hanging clothes in the morning light when the dog barked once, then again. She looked up and saw him, tall in the saddle, tan coat dusted with trail grit, silver badge catching the sun. Weston stepped out from behind the barn, rifle slung across his back. His face was stone. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Didn't expect to see you playing house, Grady." "You're not welcome here," Weston said. Burns ignored him, his eyes shifting to her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She didn't answer. "Name's Eli Burns, sheriff. Folks down east are looking for you. Said you were taken. That true?" She shook her head slowly. "I wasn't taken." Burns frowned. "Then why no word, no telegram, no letter home?" "I didn't want to be found." He laughed, dry and sharp. "That's not how the law works, sweetheart. You're somebody's daughter. Somebody with power. Right now you're considered missing property." Weston's voice came low and steady. "She's not property." Burns turned to him. "You think the judge cares what you say? He sent me to bring her back." He stepped toward her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me." Then she moved, stepped out from behind Weston, and faced the sheriff directly. Her voice was clear. "If you take me, I'll scream. I'll say you hurt me. I'll say anything I have to." Burns blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'd rather die in this cabin than go back to that house." The words fell like iron. Burns stared at her. "You're making a mistake." She didn't flinch. "Already made one. I let other people decide what my life should be. That won't happen again." Weston stepped forward, between them, his presence like a wall. "She's not going anywhere." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind cut through the trees. The dog growled softly behind the door. Burns looked from one to the other. Then he spat on the dirt, swung himself back into the saddle and muttered, "You'll regret this." They watched him ride down the trail until he vanished into the pines. Only then did Weston lower his shoulders. She stood beside him, her breathing sharp, fingers clenched. She looked up at him. "Thank you." He didn't answer, but he stayed close. That night, neither of them spoke, but something had shifted, something bold, as if, for the first time, the silence between them didn't just protect, but claimed. 2 nights later, the quiet shattered. The dog barked once, then again, sharp and urgent. Weston was already on his feet by the time the third bark cracked the silence. He moved to the door, rifle in hand, his eyes narrowed, already knowing. She followed close behind, her heart hammering in her chest. Outside, lantern light flickered between the trees. 3 men rode toward the cabin, horses kicking up dust, their faces hard and familiar. Burns was one of them. He dismounted slowly, a pistol tucked in his belt, a lantern swinging in one hand. The other 2 spread out behind him, both armed. "I gave you a chance, Grady," he called. "Told you this wasn't over." Weston stepped out onto the porch, calm as ever, rifle raised and steady. "She's not yours," Burns growled. "You're harboring stolen blood." "She belongs to no one," Weston replied, "not even me." Behind him, she stood in the doorway, shaking. but not from fear. From resolve. The shotgun hung by the hearth. Her eyes darted to it, her breath shallow. Weston had shown her how to load it once, in case of coyotes. This wasn't coyotes. She moved quickly, hands fumbling but focused. Her fingers found the shells, loaded, stepped forward. Burns shouted, "Stand down, girl! This is not your fight," but it was. The last time someone tried to drag her away, she stayed quiet. Not now. She stepped out beside Weston. "Go home, Sheriff," she said, voice trembling but clear. He sneered. "You don't get to give orders, miss." Then he reached for his gun. She didn't think, she acted. The first shot cracked like thunder, echoing through the trees. One of the deputies screamed, clutching his leg as he dropped behind a boulder. Gunfire exploded in the dark. Weston moved with terrifying precision, firing, reloading, shifting cover. A second man went down with a cry, his shoulder torn open. Burns dove behind the water trough, returning fire wildly. Wood splintered, the porch rail shattered. She ducked behind the doorframe, chest heaving. Smoke filled the air. The dog whined beneath the stairs. Then, silence. The second deputy crawled away, moaning. The third man was still, face twisted in pain. Burns emerged slowly, both hands raised. "All right," he shouted. "That's enough." Weston didn't lower the rifle. "Go," he said. Burns looked between them, blood on his cheek, pride wounded far deeper. "You'll pay for this, both of you." "This is our home now," Weston replied, low and final. "Not yours to take." Burns spat, climbed back on his horse, and vanished into the trees without another word. Inside the cabin, she leaned the shotgun against the wall and sank to the floor. Her arms shook, her breath came fast. Weston stepped in behind her, closing the door. She looked up at him, his shirt torn at the sleeve, a shallow graze bleeding along his arm. "You're hurt," she whispered. "I've had worse." "I'm sorry she started, but he shook his head. "You did what you had to." Then, for the first time, he reached out. Not to carry her, not to shield her, just took her hand in his, rough, warm, steady. She held it back, fingers curling around his, not as a man saving a woman, but as two people choosing to stand together. After the gunfire faded and the quiet returned, Weston began rebuilding. He replaced the porch rail first, sawing and sanding cedar from the ridge, his hands moving with the quiet purpose of a man who had done this before, more than once. The roof came next, reshingled with care and steady hands so no wind could slip through again. She worked beside him, in her own way. Behind the cabin she dug her hands into the soil, turned it over, found the places where roots could still breathe. She planted rows of garlic and onion, a few sprigs of basil, and in the corner, just by the edge of the porch, she buried the last of her lavender seeds. They might not bloom, but maybe they would. They never said what they were to each other. There were no confessions, no declarations, but when Weston brought home a satchel of flour, she baked bread. When she handed him a newly mended shirt, he wore it the next day. When the firewood dwindled, he stacked more by the door. And sometimes, when the wind howled, he left an extra blanket at the foot of her bed, without a word. They became a rhythm. She swept, he chopped. She stitched, he sanded. She hummed while kneading dough. He listened in silence, sharpening his blade by the hearth. Some days he said nothing at all, but left small things behind. A packet of seeds on the windowsill, a carved spoon with her initials on the handle, a knitted scarf too short and uneven but warm. She never asked for them, but she understood. His hands said what his mouth would not. One evening, they sat together by the stove, the oil lamp casting long shadows across the wooden floor. She sipped tea slowly, wrapped in the patchwork quilt he'd mended after the last snowfall. "Weston?" she said quietly, watching the flame dance. "I've lived in many places. None of them ever felt like mine." He didn't answer right away. Then he looked at her, long and steady. "Stay, then," he said. Her heart caught in her throat. The next morning, she found a small wooden box on the table. No ribbon, no note, just smooth grain and careful hinges. Inside was a thin silver chain, simple, plain. Alongside it a key-shaped pendant, rough cut, pewter washed. On one side, a single word was etched by hand, "Ours." She stared at it, fingers trembling. "You made this?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "For us?" she asked again. His answer was a low, steady, "If you want." She clutched the necklace to her chest and smiled. That afternoon, she hung the pendant by the door on a nail beside an old carved sign. The sign had only one word, burned into it with a heated knife years ago: home. Now, beneath it, another piece hung beside it, shimmering in the sun: ours. And for the first time, the cabin didn't feel like a place someone had lost. It felt like a place they had both chosen. Summer came quietly to the mountain, softening the edges of everything. Vines climbed up the new cedar posts of the porch. Wildflowers bloomed in the cracks between stones. The scent of baked bread drifted from the cabin each morning, yeast and honey and something warm that felt like memory. The rhythm of their days was unspoken. Weston rode down to the valley to trade. She tended the garden, coaxing basil and lavender into life. He'd left his boots by the door now. She mended his shirts without needing to ask. One morning she stood by the open window, a scrap of old wood in one hand, a piece of charcoal in the other. She pressed the charcoal to the surface slowly, tracing each curve and line with care. Clara. Not her old name. Not the name they used in the telegrams and courtrooms and letters she never opened. This was a name she chose, one she whispered to herself at night, let settle into her bones, until it felt like it had always belonged to her. She hung the sign on a nail outside the kitchen window. Weston didn't say anything when he saw it, but the next morning, as they split wood together beneath the early sun, he handed her a mug of coffee and said softly, "Clara?" She looked up, smiled. Later that week, she found him sitting on the back porch, carving a block of wood with his pocket knife, slow and methodical. "What are you making?" she asked. He didn't answer. 3 days later, the answer appeared. Above the front door, newly hung, was a sign. The Grady home. Not Grady's cabin, not Weston's place, but home. Something shared. And that night, as the fire cracked, and wind moved through the trees outside, Clara sat at the table while Weston cleaned his rifle in silence. She placed a single piece of folded paper in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. She didn't flinch. "I don't need a wedding," it read, "but if you want me to stay forever, just say so." He stared at it for a moment. Then he took the pencil from the counter and wrote beneath her words, "You stayed the day you came back." He passed it back without ceremony. And that was all. There was no wedding, no rings, no guests or dances or photos. But they had harvests to tend and winters to prepare for. They had names to say at dusk and seeds to sow at dawn. They had the silence between them that asked nothing, proved everything. They slept under the same quilt, ate from the same plates, laughed, sometimes, at the old dog chasing birds it would never catch. Clara said his name now when she called him from the field. Weston said hers each morning with a cup of tea. No one needed to witness it, because it was already real. Months passed. A traveler came through Silver Bluff one autumn, stopping at the saloon to trade stories over whiskey and stew. He spoke of a cabin in the hills, one without a name on any map. Said it belonged to a man with a scar on his jaw and a woman with eyes like mountain storms. "They don't talk much," he said, "but they look at each other like they've been to hell and come back together." No one interrupted. Some nodded, some whispered, but no one dared speak against it. And that's the story. Of a woman who had no name and no place to run. Of a man who had lost everything but made room for someone else's pain. Not with words, not with vows, but with stillness, with space, with staying. Because in a world full of noise, they built a life from silence and chose every day to stay. Together. Always. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that love does not always arrive with fanfare, but sometimes in silence, in patience, in the quiet choosing of each other day after day, then you've just met the soul of what we do here. At Soul-Stirring Stories, we bring you tales of resilience, healing, and the kind of connection that doesn't need witnesses to be real. If you believe in love that rises from ashes, in peace found far from the noise, and in second chances given not with promises but presence, then this is your home too. Like, comment, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more unforgettable journeys of the heart. And remember, sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones the world never sees, only feels.